Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for this important topic on understanding trauma in refugee youth, pre-flight, flight, and post-flight. I have a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you need help troubleshooting during this presentation, please email us at info@brycs.org, or you can use the chat pod on the right-hand side of your screen. We will be recording and archiving this webinar. If you are a registrant and on right now, you will receive a follow-up email with that recording link and a copy of the slides. We hope to have everything posted by Monday. As a courtesy, we have muted all of the phone lines. And finally, during our Q&A session, please use the chat pod on the right once again to submit any of your questions. We do have over 500 registrants for today's webinar, so if we don't get to your question, we will post those questions on our blog and forum, and we will follow up with your questions there and continue the conversation there. So we have a number of experts on today's call. First, we have Jenny Lange with National Partnership for Community Training, and that's a program of the Gulf Coast Jewish and Family Community Services. Jenny's the director there. We also have Goli Amin Bellinger. She is a BRYCS consultant and an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Social Work. We also have Julie Baker, who is the Education Program Manager at Refugee Center Online, which is a nonprofit website with online resources for refugees and receiving community members. And finally, we have Osab Issa, an RCO board member and a program coordinator at Boston Children's Hospital and the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center. So for today, we'll begin with a holistic perspective on refugee youth, and that will include Maslow's hierarchy of needs and cover the triple trauma paradigm in regards to migration. We'll then move into understanding trauma during the stages of pre-flight, flight, and post-flight, looking at individual reactions to trauma through three case studies. And then we'll look at the role of social and cultural factors in adolescent trauma. We'll end today's webinar with some specific considerations that schools and school personnel can take. So we hope that you guys will all leave today with an appreciation on the complexity of the multiple traumatic experiences that refugee youth face. We also hope that you become familiar with the pertinent theories surrounding youth trauma and understand the varying degrees of the impact that this trauma has on the various stages of migration. We also hope that you'll be able to distinguish between the social and cultural factors involved in adolescent trauma, and finally, understand the overall impact that trauma exposure has on the individual, family, their school, and their community. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Jenny, who will get us started on that holistic perspective.
Great. Thanks so much, Jackie. And good afternoon to everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you all today and really appreciate your joining in the discussion. As Jackie mentioned, I'll be going through the framework of two major theories that can help offer some clarity and background when working with refugee youth. And then I'll end by sharing a few thoughts around the strengths of refugee youth. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs offers us a holistic understanding of individuals, including refugee youth. This version of Maslow's hierarchy is for youth specifically. You can see at the bottom of the triangle is physiological needs, which are the very basic food and shelter type of needs that every human requires to live a healthy life. The theory behind Maslow's hierarchy is that without this bottom level, individuals are not able to move upward toward the other levels of needs. For example, a refugee youth who is perhaps currently living in a temporary hotel for a few days after first arriving to the U.S., they may not be able to fully focus on school objectives or future academic goals until they're able to obtain some more permanent housing. So moving up this triangle comes safety, which for youth may mean predictability in daily or weekly routines at home and at school. And again, under this theory, without that core physiological and safety needs met, the child will have a really difficult time reaching for these other needs. Love and belongingness is often characterized by caring relationships with adult figures in the youth or child's life, and the need to belong or feel accepted into a group. Esteem needs, the second from the top, refers to self-esteem, that one is worthwhile, competent, and independent. And the focus really shifts away from just surviving to doing well according to meaningful communal standards. And finally, the top need is self-actualization. As all of these other needs are being met or fully met, the youth or child can really focus more on developing their needs to the fullest extent. So this theory, really helps gives us a well-rounded look at each refugee youth that we may come in contact with. So you can begin to ask yourself, which of these needs are currently being met in the child's life, which ones are not being met, and how can I help to address the gaps in any of the needs. Okay. So the triple trauma paradigm is a concept that assists individuals working with refugees, survivors of torture, and others who have experienced forced migration to recognize the previous and current unique challenges faced through the forced migration process. Under this theory, as you can see on your screen, there are three major phases: pre-flight, flight, and post-flight. The post-flight is also termed resettlement for those with refugee status. So I should also note that all of these phases, including resettlement, can be considered a traumatic experience for refugee youth. So we're just going to go through each of these stages one by one. Pre-flight refers to events that have occurred leading up to the ultimate decision of fleeing one's home country. These events can include physical harassment, loss of property, threats to the family, false imprisonment, and the type of socio-political climate within the country of origin that has caused a prolonged fear and hopelessness. And it should also be noted that these events can occur over the course of several or many years before the individual or family is forced to flee. And then moving down to the flight stage of the triple trauma paradigm, this is characterized by the separation of the immediate threat faced within the country of origin, which can come with some sense of relief. However, many within this flight stage will continue to face additional traumatic events. And those events can include prolonged brutal violence, abuse and discrimination from border officials or human smugglers, dangerous travel across difficult terrain, long stretches of living within a temporary refugee camp, which often have inadequate health services, little safety from the surrounding militia, and can lack a lot of basic necessities. So this stage is really full of uncertainty about the future and when or where that may be for the family and indeed for the child or youth. So that chronic high stress of this flight stage is often re-traumatizing for refugees who have experienced trauma in the past. And then the final stage is post-flight. So this refers to the period of resettlement in the third country, which would be in the United States for our purposes here. And this often comes with another sense of relief and permanency. However, resettling to a new country is a monumental task that has many challenges, including learning another language, finding new employment, navigating a foreign healthcare system, and even locating, the nearest grocery store. So most refugees adjust to their new neighborhoods and communities well, with offering their own cultural strengths and adjusting to their surrounding environment's cultural expectations. And then this is my final slide on the triple trauma paradigm. Once refugees have been resettled, the immediate threat, so to speak, has been removed. The family is no longer living within a refugee camp, scared for their safety due to local militia, and they have a resettlement worker, a resettlement agency who can help them through this adjustment process. However, during this time, individuals and families who are now able to really sit down and breathe may begin to address those past traumatic experiences. And while they may not have had time to recognize those events in the past and process through them due to these chronic unsafe living conditions, they may now find some unexpected symptoms showing up in their jobs, with refugee youth. It'd be within their classrooms, within their families. So these symptoms may start showing up as a result of that past trauma. A major component of resettlement and this post-flight stage is cultural bereavement, which refers to losing cornerstone pieces of one's culture. This can include language, social support, family members, and community. And losing so many integral parts of one's identity can have that lasting impact. So it's important to realize this as you work directly with refugee youth who are not only navigating a new culture every day, but who also may be grieving the loss of many of the cultural supports that they used to benefit from. And just a couple other notes on this slide. I want to note that refugee populations, we tend to make generalizations, but they really have such unique experiences. Whether they're from Iraq, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Burma, Myanmar, all have a very unique set of experiences and events surrounding why they've had to flee. Some populations have literally spent generations in refugee camps due to decades of internal warfare in their country of origin. And others have faced harrowing flights from their country of origin to a neighboring country very recently. So for some youth, they may either face that trauma firsthand or hear about it through family members. But it's just good to recognize that each population, certainly each family and each individual will have very unique experiences. So to that end, when working with refugees, I always encourage folks to remain curious about your clients. As you build trust with your clients, with your students, with your patients, just realize and recognize that those experiences are unique to them. And again, while you may have, a really good understanding of the population or the country of origin that they associate with, you are still open to learning their individual story. Okay. So we've discussed Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the triple trauma paradigm as foundational theories for working with refugee youth. Good background knowledge. I put this in here because I feel like it is incredibly important to recognize and honor the strengths of refugee youth. This slide has some information that, it shows how refugee youth really straddle vulnerability and empowerment during resettlement in the U.S. So I want to just discuss this for a moment as it can counter some of the ways we may initially view refugee youth. So for most of you on the webinar today, you work with refugee youth directly or your organization supports refugee youth in some form. And so my question to you is, what image or phrase do you associate with refugee youth? Perhaps you're new to working with refugee youth, or you've been doing this for years. What are the types of images or words that pop into your head when you hear the phrase refugee youth? And you don't have to share that, but I would encourage you just to take a moment to think about it. Because I know that for a lot of us, a lot of providers, it can be easy to see a perpetual victim, to only see the child through that chronic stress, through the traumatic experiences, and that they just need to be helped. So while that is a pretty obvious generalization, I do think that a lot of us can get in the habit of only seeing the trauma when working with youth. However, research shows that refugee youth exhibit great leadership skills during resettlement. During this very difficult time in their lives and their families' lives, they show leadership skills. So of course they have very specific vulnerabilities as children and youth and coming from refugee backgrounds, but they do have and continue to grow immense strength in helping their families through this very difficult process. And that helping their families during resettlement can increase the refugee youth's sense of self-worth. So by acknowledging, the vulnerabilities and the strengths of refugee youth and being able to honor both of those, encompassing a well-rounded and holistic perspective, we can begin and continue to support and empower much more effectively. So to that end, you can enhance refugee youth strengths in many areas, and all areas, I would argue. Whether you're a community worker, healthcare provider, educator, or other, you can foster strengths in your particular setting. So some of our presenters will be going into a little bit more detail, but I did just want to offer a few examples to kind of get the discussion going. So if you work within the community at a rec center or community-based support services, consider partnering with your local refugee resettlement agency, especially if they have a youth program. They may have great suggestions for how to incorporate activities like soccer or cultural exchanges that can be co-led or co-facilitated by the refugee youth themselves. If you're a healthcare provider, ask your refugee youth patients how they care for their own health, and be able to meet them where they're at and work off of those healthy, positive practices that they're currently doing to build that treatment plan. And if you're an educator, as I'm sure many of you do this, but I would consider learning from your students if you don't already. Have students share important words or phrases or pictures and images, that that are important to them, and have them, be able to share why that's important to them. And then finally, I want to say for everyone, really, I just want to applaud you, because I think that you are really taking the first step towards empowerment by learning about refugee youth here today. So thank you. That's all that I have.
Thanks, Jenny. Okay, so with that, we'll turn it over to Goli, and Goli will get us started on the next part of our presentation today in understanding trauma during the stages of pre-flight, flight, and post-flight.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Jackie, for organizing this for everyone. I want to illustrate the impact of trauma on individuals coming from pre-flight, flight, and after flight in the United States to 3 different case studies. Each of these case studies are from cases that individual youth that I've met. They each experienced trauma as a child, fled the country as a youth under the age of 18. And I met them within a year or 2 after being in the United States as they were seeking asylum. The first case is an asylum seeker from Somalia, male. He's part of a tribe that's a minority tribe, and that's not in power. And he, based on different interactions, different events, he ended up being tortured and fled due to his tribal affiliation. First, at the age of 14, he was tortured one day after getting into a fight on the soccer football field with another boy from the majority tribe. He following the football match, he was approached in his home by the police and the other young boy, and he was detained for a couple of days and tortured and beaten up pretty badly until he was finally released. A couple years later, he ended up falling in love with a young girl, also from the majority group, and this relationship was forbidden. So eventually he decided that he wanted to marry her. And the 2 of them attempted to run away, and they were going to cross the border and go into Kenya. He had gotten this idea from his brother, one of his brothers, who had done the same thing many, many years before. And so in their escape from the family, they were caught by her brother, and so this boy ended up running, and within a couple days, his father arranged for him to immediately leave the country and fly to another nation in Africa for safety. Unfortunately, while there as an urban refugee, and an undocumented urban refugee, he was a victim of several incidents of crime, and it ended with a pretty horrific sexual violence assault incident, in which he immediately fled the country and eventually ended up in the United States. So what I'd like to, with each one of these cases, I want to point out that while there are traumas within the general population, the individual traumatic memories and experiences of the youth differ than what we may expect. So as Jenny said, this idea of remaining curious about your client. Now, within Somalia, the general population for years has been experiencing intermittent periods of civil war. There's ongoing militia and terroristic violence and recruitment of young boys, kidnapping of girls, and forced marriages, all by what's recognized as a terrorist organization, Al-Shabaab. And there's, in such chaos, there's usually always discrimination and differential treatment of minority groups. Some of you may recall a few years ago, U.S. government resettled a group of refugees that were minorities, the Somali Bantu. This boy, his most traumatic memories were not from war or avoiding Al-Shabaab and their kind of pressures and harassment, but it was really feeling so different from a very young age as a child. His youngest memory is of his grandmother forbidding him to play with the other kids because the other kids were from the majority population, the majority tribal group. He was also later on, once by the time he got into school, he noticed that he and his peers that were not from the majority tribe, they were the only ones that experienced corporal punishment. The other children did not receive that and were, protected. Of course, later on, when he was forbid to marry his girlfriend that he was in love with, and then within a few years, shortly after that, after he married, once he was in the second country of refuge, he met another girl, and he ended up marrying and starting a family, but based on the incidents of sexual assault, he immediately sent her to safety back to Somalia, because that was considered to him much safer for her than what was happening in the city. And then he subsequently fled to the United States. Now, I want to point out, we talked about the traumas and the traumatic incidents the youth have come from, but the resiliency, we in this field, we try to talk a lot about resiliency and youth strengths. So I'll be illustrating that with each one of these cases, resiliency and goals. For him, one of the things that was just really amazing, he survived transit through the Americas. Not only did he manage to flee his country and go to another country, but eventually managed to flee there, and he ended up on a boat all the way to Brazil. From there, traveled the Americas until he crossed the U.S. border and asked for asylum. He has developed English fluency. He was detained in an immigration detention center, and there he spent a lot of time really trying to learn as much as possible about America. He was really committed. I'm going to stay here. I have to know, and quickly became fluent in English. And he finds a lot of solace in, he's Muslim, and of course his daily prayers, but he regularly fasts on his own in the detention center. His goals are to get asylum and become free, be able to reunite his family and bring his daughter and wife to the United States, and really worries a lot about their health and, of course, their safety with the ongoing problems in Somalia. So, moving on to the second case, this young boy is from Central America. This is a case where he was abused by his father a lot of physical abuse starting from a very young age, and also by the age of 12 to 15, he was unsupervised for several years as he was pursuing secondary education outside of his town. So the primary first few years of school were in his hometown, but to be able to continue and further his education, he had to leave town. So his siblings in the United States had arranged for him to go to a nearby town. Unfortunately, there was no parental supervision, and there was a lot of gang activity, unlike his hometown. And there was a lot of pressure to join gangs, and there was a lot of different incidents of violence that he had to endure and avoid. So within the general population, the three Central American nations, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, all of them are ridden with gang violence. And a variety of different drug-related violence and crimes and group organizations and militias. They may be called NS-18, or they may be referred to as Maras, or simply the group, the young boys at the corner. And depending on what the illicit economy is in the area somebody may be from, whether it's an area where they're growing opium, or there's violence and drug-related crimes from the farmers impacting communities all the way up to the distributors and the exporters of the drugs. In all three of these nations, there's a lot of extortion from these different groups of gangs, or as I said, they're different organized groups. In Honduras, it's actually called, the extortion's actually called a war tax, in the guerra. In El Salvador, it's called rent. So it's families are really exposed to a lot of very difficult and violent circumstances in living there. This youth's most traumatic experiences really was the rejection of his father. The reason he left the country and came to the United States was because he had an altercation with his father. He confronted his father after years of verbal abuse and physical abuse that he did of his mother. He finally stood up, and his father really rejected him and kicked him out of the home and told him, "You're no longer my son." Another of the years of child abuse that he experienced, his worst memory was of an incident of being choked by his father with a rope around his neck. He couldn't, when he was 8 years old, he couldn't figure out, he still has no memory of why this happened, but he was so terrified that he lost bladder control. His resiliency today is evident in the fact that he escaped the gangs. He successfully was able to abstain from all the pressures of gang activity and being involved, drinking and drugs. He was quite proud of abstaining. The way he defended his mother as he had gotten older, he was 16 years old at the point of leaving. The way he defended his mother, he's still proud, and he's still supporting his mother, sending money back home now and supporting her. What I also really saw as a resilient strength was he laughed a lot. And really, I saw laughing as a coping skill. He would, in telling me something upsetting or disturbing, he would kind of smirk or smile or giggle first, or chuckle for a second. It wasn't a happy moment, but it was something that really broke off the tension and it really helped him relax a little bit based on what he was telling me, as well as the tension within the room, both with me and also the interpreter of hearing so many of the traumatic details. If you're interested, I've written a piece on BRYCS' blog about laughter and trauma and laughing as a coping skill. You can look that up on their blog. His goals are work, to have a permanent work authorization and be able to work and establish himself in the United States since he's lost his inheritance and his home, became homeless in his country of origin, and continue his education. He had his eyes set on a specific type of vocational training, what he wanted to do with his life. Okay. Now, the final case study, this is a West African family. She was forced, she's a victim of survivor of torture victim, and for seeking asylum based on her political activities and involvement. She was first in school. She participated in protests and groups that met within a political party, youth groups that met in organizing different protests. So she was detained at 3 different points, and each time tortured. The last time was the worst, where she was sexually violated. She herself, her mother, she grew up with a single mother. Her mother was also very politically active prior to having her, but her mother was also tortured and raped, and she was born out of that trauma. She got married in her country of origin and had a daughter, and subsequently, even though she tried to completely disengage herself from any political activity to protect her daughter, she was still being pursued, and eventually fled because of that. So there's the general traumas within the population. There's political divisions throughout the country, and there's a lot of strife between the majority population in power and the minority groups, and a lot of industry strikes and protests, and violent protests also throughout the country that end up with people being detained and further persecuted and tortured, as she was. For her, though, the worst, most traumatic memories are, one, growing up fatherless. She recalled deep embarrassment and shame from when she was young and in school. The school personnel would ask her, there was a couple memories she had where they looked at her birth certificate and pointed out, you have no father here, your mother must have been a prostitute. It's really deep, deep shame. Of course, she was also, as I said, sexually assaulted. She was raped, actually, like her mother, while she was pregnant. And a couple things that really bothered her. She was politically active, and while those, political activity is not against the law, she was detained with, as she several times described, in a quite disturbed way, with gang members and hardened criminals. She also saw kind of the detention experience when she came to the U.S., and subsequently having ankle bracelet monitoring her movements as just similar, and really couldn't understand why she's just involved in politics, these things could happen to her. So those things really were quite upsetting. still to this day. And her worst, the worst thing that happened to her, which despite all the torture and all the abuse as a child, by the time she had her own child, when her child was, there was 2 attempted kidnappings by the public officials of her daughter. By the second one, she immediately, within a couple of days, left the country. The resiliency today, she has extreme major depression and the post-traumatic stress disorder, a lot of flashbacks and nightmares. She has no friends, but what she does do is every day she takes her daughter outside to play. She's really living for her child. Unlike her husband, who unfortunately was so distraught, really from the period of flight to post-flight coming into the United States, he had developed major depression and psychosis with a lot of paranoia that he eventually left the United States, went back to their country of origin, and within a few months she found out that he had taken his life. So she's still holding on. That's all she thinks about is her daughter. She's also politically active. Despite everything that had happened to her, she proudly joined the political party that she was part of in her country of origin here, and participates in their meetings regularly here. And she fought and fought and fought until she finally got asylum granted, and now is kind of starting that new part of her life. As Jenny talked about, the flight and post-flight, well, post-flight is also resettlement for people who are brought into this country, for people who come into this country and ask for asylum. It can really be a very long process until they can successfully gain asylum. And for her, I think it was a good couple years. So her goals are to be able to, she still hasn't told, months later, hasn't told her child about her father being gone, and how she's going to, trying to learn and figure out how to raise this child on her own. Her goals are to take nursing classes and to return to church. She lost her sense of spirituality and religion with everything that had happened, but really intends on, now that she has asylum, to try to reconnect back to the community, to reconnect to a community, because she's so isolated. Okay, so I share these stories with you when you're thinking about the experiences that the youth may have come with, and being curious about, try to frame the trauma around these areas, which I also presented. So one is the present stressors. What's an active stressor? What's happening currently that's hurting the child, upsetting the family? What are the difficult struggles currently? What are the lasting past stressors? For the last woman I talked to you about, yes, she grew up fatherless. That's not an issue now because she is starting her new family now. She's not focused on that trauma yet. That trauma returned now that she lost her husband to suicide, and now her daughter has to grow up also fatherless. Consider the family roles and responsibilities. Youth say, Jenny was talking about youth really being leaders. They end up being leaders even within their own families and take on a lot of responsibility. And that sense of responsibility, especially very young youth that have started their own families after separating from theirs through migration, there's quite a sense of responsibility that helps them keep going and really, I think, mitigates the impact of the traumatic events and traumatic history. Other mitigators are really the individual wants and desires and dreams. If you can connect to that, they can help decrease the intensity of the past traumas. In addition to that, social connection. are really very important in decreasing the impact of trauma and really leading to increasing healing. The first boy that I told you about, the Somali youth, even though he was in a detention center while waiting for asylum, he made friends. He made a lot of friends, and he ended up being in a county jail detained there. So he was with the majority American population, and he made some really good friends with white Americans, Black Americans, Latinos, and learned so much about the American culture. And they really gave him so much hope that, don't worry, you'll get asylum, it'll be okay, don't worry. So he even identified a best friend that would give him little gifts in the jail. The second case, his social connections were really coming to the United States with his sister, the same one that he lived with while they went to school, unsupervised in their neighboring town. Now they're here together and they're reunited with another sibling. So this connection of family and to family that's been previously established here. The last case I told you about, she said more than once to me, I have no friends. I have absolutely no friends. But her social connections, her only source of social connections, that she couldn't do it through church, was the political party that she was part of and the meetings she participated. The last part I want to focus on is this concept of adolescence. The cases I've shared with you are really about children experiencing trauma through their teen years and through what's an extended, really, an adolescent stage goes to the mid-20s. Recent research has really established adolescence doesn't end at age 18. However, there's a certain perception of what an adolescent is and culture that I'd like you to think about that differs what we have here in the West. In the United States, really, that once you're a teenager, caution, you're supposed to be bad, they're difficult children, and even now in the recent years established a new category, preteen, also caution, warning, they're going to be difficult, it's going to be hard for the family. In talking with children from all around the world, these are some quotes I wanted to share. It kind of illustrates different cultures' perspectives on what an adolescent is and this teenager. So one you told me, I didn't know I was supposed to be bad. Another said, we don't have this in my country. One said, in my country, this was actually the Somali youth that I just told you about that was tortured. In my country, you can have a baby at 16. You are an adult. Me looking at him as, you were tortured as a child. Well, at 16, I'm an adult, and I have a family, and I have a daughter that I'm responsible for. Doesn't see himself as a child. Another is this American sense of independence, starting once you finish high school at the age of 18 or start employment, start college, separating and having become fully independent through the experience of the teenage years by the age of 18. I've heard this comment more than once, that we don't move out until we marry, 20s, 30s, even 40. The sense of separation is and adolescent period is much different. So in summary, just to keep in mind that trauma exposure does not equal a traumatized child or youth or adult, really. What may be or sound horrific, war, torture, gangs, these stories we're hearing about, the new, the Syrian refugees coming or the Congolese refugees coming, may really sound horrific, but it doesn't actually impact refugees as one would expect. So really, as Jenny said, keep curious. And finally, experiences of trauma are unique to each individual based on their social and cultural context and their culture's ideas about adolescence and trauma and family and responsibility.
Great. Thank you so much, Goli.
Thank you.
Next, we will move on to some school-specific considerations. We have Julie from the Refugee Center Online and Osab Isa, RCO board member and a coordinator at the Boston Children's Hospital and Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center, who will cover this topic. You may have to hit *1 to unmute yourselves, ladies.
Great. Thank you, Jackie, and thank you for working very hard to organize this. Hi, everyone. So I'll be sharing with you school stressors and trauma that some refugee youth experience back in their country and here in the U.S. In the pre-resettlement phase, children speak their native language, whereas in the resettlement phase, they have to learn the English language and sometimes are required to take other languages such as Spanish or French. Back home, some refugee youth and children start school when they can walk and talk, and if the family have enough resources. But here in the U.S., it's determined by the age of the child. Many refugee children have experienced a lack of formal education or very different style of schooling. It might be their first time that they are placed in learning structure. When they come to the United States, they have to adjust to school culture and norms, which can be hard for most of them. For example, when I worked at the middle school in Boston area, some of the Somali boys would horseplay during class, which then result in them being sent to the school principal. Parents will get a call from the school and they will be frustrated because the boys horseplay or fight, which is part of the Somali culture. In some cultures, like in Somalia, disabilities are only that which is observable and physical. For example, autism is not a diagnosis that most parents accept or understand. Most of you know assessing one's learning abilities is part of the American norm. But most refugee parents don't like the fact that their children are placed in school education structure, and that's because they don't want their children to be labeled and fear that such diagnosis will follow the children for the rest of their lives. Back home, children live in stable communities, and loneliness was not part of their day-to-day experience. After resettling in America, with parents working multiple jobs to make the ends meet, children experience a sense of disconnect, isolation, and lack of support networks.
So the Refugee,
Go ahead, Jules.
The Refugee Center Online did a survey in 2015. We included over 120 middle and high school students who are refugees that are now in the U.S., and this included over 15 different ethnic minorities and schools that were both in urban, suburban, and rural settings. And this is just a snapshot. We included other questions that you could find on our site as well if you're interested in more. But this seems like an important thing to include on understanding how refugee students feel when they're entering school. So you can see here that when students start school in the U.S., half of them, 50%, felt confused. 49% felt scared. Also, you can tell people were allowed to select more than one emotion here. And only 8% felt confident. 44% felt lonely. So there's a range of emotions, and there are some positive, and then there are a lot of fearful and more negative emotions as well.
Great. Thank you, Jackie. Trauma can impair learning. Exposure to a single traumatic event might cause jumpiness, intrusive thoughts, interrupted sleep, nightmares, anger, moodiness, and or social withdrawal, any of which can interfere with concentration and memory. For refugee students, it's not one traumatic event, rather a lifelong exposure to trauma. For instance, one of the Somali boys that I worked with, whose mother died when he was a little boy, was then separated from his biological father and was sent to live with his aunt and uncle in the refugee camps in Kenya. When they came to the U.S., he lived in a community where he witnessed shooting and other type of violence. So the teachers were wondering why he was not paying attention, and often the school administrators and academic staff view him as lazy or not motivated to learn, when in fact his work was not conducive to learning effectively without addressing the real issues for such a disengagement. Trauma can impair learning. Chronic exposure to traumatic events, especially during childhood years, can adversely impact attention, memory, cognition, reduce child's ability to focus, organize, and process information, and interfere with effective problem solving and planning. It can also result in overwhelming feelings of frustration and anxiety. It can be hard to identify trauma-related symptoms in refugee children at school. Children who show destructive behaviors as a response to a traumatic reminder can appear to be oppositional or unmotivated. School-related protective factors for refugee youth. Research has shown that higher levels of sense of belongingness were significantly associated with lower level of symptoms of PTSD and depression, and higher levels of self-efficacy. Yes, trauma can affect a refugee child on individual, educational, and familial level. However, just because a student is a refugee, it does not mean he or she has experienced trauma. Many refugee children adjust very well to new school settings and often quickly pick up the language and the cultural norms. I apologize, I'm switching my slides slowly. Pathways to healing. So when we ask refugee families how do they handle it when their children misbehave, and they said that they try to hide their problems. They try to solve problems within families and close friends. They try to talk to religious leaders, and if that doesn't work, then they try to talk to a school teacher, counselor, and if nothing works, they try to send their child to a mental health professional or send it back to Africa. So what can we do? So we can all recognize that behavior problems could be associated to trauma-related anxiety. We can give the children and youth a choice, anticipate difficult situations and provide additional support, respect the family roles, and refer those that need higher levels of needs and support them. And finally, create a more welcoming environment. And there's a Somali prophet that says, "Akol an wa iftin an," which means if there is no light without knowledge. And this is a page that just shows you additional resources, but I will go over a few of them. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with NCTSN, but you can go to our Refugee Trauma webpage. It's divided into 4 sections. The first one, you can learn about refugee experience, trauma, refugee trauma, and more. The second one is information for providers and services. And the third one is additional resources. And the fourth one is tools and trainings. And finally, there is please check out our RST assessment tool. It's a free resource that are available to you. It's easy for providers to become overwhelmed when working with refugee children and their families. And this assessment tool will help you identify the needs associated with their mental health and ensure that they are connected with most appropriate intervention. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thanks, Asab. Could you remind us again, could you say again what the Somali saying is that you mentioned?
Yes. Sorry, I might have went a little fast. It's called Akong An wa Iftin An, and it means there's no light without knowledge.
No light without knowledge. Okay, thank you. It's very beautiful. Okay, with that, I will open it up for questions. If you have any questions for our presenters, please use the chat pod on the right, and we will open up the question and answer portion of our webinar. I am seeing some questions regarding whether or not these slides will be made available. Yes, we will send around a copy of the PowerPoint along with the recording and the resources that have just been mentioned to all of the registrants for today's call. I hope to get that out to you all sometime Monday. We have a question here about whether or not any of our experts have experience surrounding trauma-informed approaches in early childhood in preschool settings. Gulf Coast, would you have any resources for early childhood?
Sorry, yes, I think I was on mute. I know that, well, I think the resources that you've got on the screen now are the ones that we would probably point to. We can dig up and do a little bit of research for pre-K, I think is what the question was around. I know we have information around different screenings, but I can take a look and see if we've got anything specific for very young children, and I can send that to you, Jackie.
Okay, wonderful. Another question, what advice would you have for refugee youth who only get 1 to 2 years of public education before they graduate or need to move on from the public school system? Perhaps Julie and RCO, you can speak to that.
Yes, that is a limitation with some with how American schools are set up, in that we are placed by age, and it is inappropriate to put an 18-year-old with someone who might speak at his level of English if he is new to the country. So some of the things that we recommend are follow a lot of the current practices with English language learners in terms of placing students in situations where they are able to utilize their native language at the same time as they are growing and learning in their English skills. We encourage adapting the curriculum to fit what they are able to handle. So finding different ways to communicate in terms of perhaps you are changing an assignment that would have been a formal written paper, and now you are allowing them to orally explain some of the concepts to you. So there's some modifications that you can make for students who are in that situation. And then, there's really a lot of growth happening with GED programs and other alternative high school degrees or vocational schools that we really recommend, you can't write off, that they are great opportunities, especially for those who are not going to have the credit to graduate high school on time with their a typical high school diploma. So hopefully that answers a little bit.
Thanks. We have another question too. Perhaps Goli, you can answer this. Can you talk more about how teachers or other individuals working with refugees can better identify when trauma is an issue? What are the key signs they can look for? So how do we know that? How can you tell the difference between a child who's just acting up or really struggling?
Well, so I guess you're talking about a child that's not classically maybe crying or sleeping in class or missing class. One that's pretty disruptive, it sounds like, by using the word acting up. I would recommend, pulling the child aside and just kind of asking them, is everything okay? And kind of, if they're acting up, they're usually, they're trying to get some kind of attention and any individualized attention in a safe, private manner where they're not in trouble, but just you're wondering about if there's anything, how are things at home, what's he worried about, is he having any bad dreams, questions like that in a safe, private kind of format I would do.
Thank you. We have a question here. One of the slides identified a stressor as being the difficulty in assessing students for learning disabilities. Does RCO have any resources or advice on navigating that barrier in a school setting?
One of the recommendations that we make is to do being aware of it will help, first of all. To know that someone who is limited in English knowledge or who has experienced, moving and other traumatic experiences might look like someone who would qualify for services, but may not actually have the same, the causes might be different. So being aware would be the first step, to know that it might look like that, but that might not be the case. And then the second recommendation I would make is to make sure you're looking at all the facets of the student. So you're not just looking at test scores, but you're also looking at social skills and, effort and other pieces of the puzzle that may not be represented well when you're just looking at a report card or one paper that a student turns in, but being able to really look at the student as a whole to determine whether you think is it a language issue, is it an emotional issue, or is it actually something that would qualify for an IEP or a 504. So being aware and then making sure you're taking a lot of things into account when you're making those decisions.
Thank you. Jenny, would you be able to talk about the conflict between, or the struggle between respecting family roles that conflict with U.S. cultural norms?
Sure, yeah. Let's see, family roles that, sorry, will you repeat it again? I see lots of questions over here. But.
Yeah, how traditional family roles can conflict with our cultural norms here in the U.S. and how we can help manage that.
Yeah, that's a loaded question for sure. And there's definitely a lot of complexity in that. I would say that your best bet is going in with an open mind, and certainly being able to provide education on all levels. And I don't mean education in a classroom setting. I mean, sharing with the refugee family about U.S. cultural norms, and then sharing with whoever's involved in their life, whatever the conflict is arising from, if it's with law enforcement, if it's with, state employees, if it's with the school, being able to have open and ongoing discussions where it's not, I'm speaking to you or at you, but we're having a conversation with everyone, and everyone's learning about one another. It's not just the refugee family or child learning about American culture, but certainly it's a two-way or a multi-way educational opportunity. So that's usually the recommendation that I would give with any kind of conflict, getting the right people in the same room and being able to share with one another.
Great, thank you. For Goli, have you noticed a benefit from formally assessing for PTSD in refugee youth in order to tailor or specify their treatment?
There's a few things there are a few symptoms of PTSD that would help better understand what's happening to a child in a classroom, and when setting up treatment. But it's different with setting up treatment. Just in better understanding what's happening to a child, really knowing, is the child having nightmares? What's the content of the nightmares? Is the child having flashbacks? Are they having memories in class of bad things? Is the child distracted easily? How is it affecting their concentration? With these it's kind of like X-ray sensory things that are going on. These experiences a child may have right in the middle of a classroom, or they're not sleeping well, or they're having nightmares, so they're not going to sleep, or they're waking up too much in the middle of the night. A child's going to be much more tired in your classroom, and just have a harder time performing well, and including like keeping up with the homework assignments. So I think it's beneficial, but I also, of course it's beneficial just kind of knowing what's happening to the child and how that may be affecting them in the classroom. At the same time, any formal assessment I don't usually share the labels with the use of any kind of mental disorder. But I use it as a way of, identifying what are they grappling with and helping them understand some of the things to try to normalize it and give them words for it, flashbacks, and just it's okay, this will go away with time, things like that, to be able to intervene at that level.
Great, thanks, Goli. For Julia and Osab, are there activities that encourage students to tell their stories actually beneficial in general?
I think it's always good to give kids and youth a time, especially when they are new to the country. I think that so give them a time for them to tell their own story how they want. I think it depends the setting. If you are working with a child in a one-on-one therapy, usually I would say art or any kind of a drawing. Kids feel comfortable telling their story. If it's in a group setting with all girls, like a group support, then they can tell their stories. But in terms of activities, I would say enough kind of art activities or hands-on activities for girls and for boys. It could really be an outside activities, any kind of outside activities where they don't have to look at you face to face. They could engage the activity that's happening outside or you're doing with them, and they could be telling their stories. But I think often people assume that refugees, because they went through trauma, that they have to tell their stories right away or they have something to share. But everyone is at a different place, and some it might take 3 years to tell their stories.
And how would you work with a youth that is very timid to open up and express their feelings? What if they were very shy about sharing their story?
I think I would start by kind of respecting that space first. I mean, we should not be rushing to get their stories because I think that people, at least in Somali culture, sharing your stories with strangers is very taboo. You share your stories with people that you know, people you feel very comfortable. But I think really kind of getting to know them and building a relationship, and over time, person will, of course, build that relationship and tell their stories.
I would also add, this is Goli, that there's a variety of stories these children have. The one Somali youth I was talking about, while there are plenty of stories he could have, he shared with me about civil war and about torture, there were some really very interesting and I think really informative stories just about a child's understanding that he, from a very young age, knew something was wrong when he could tell at a very young age that there was disproportionate treatment, differential treatment based on what group one belonged to. At a very young age, he could tell that there was discrimination. And what does that mean now? How is that? We can even see that in the United States. How does he experience that as a child in school? There's other stories to get to.
Yeah, and thank you, Goli. The last thing I wanted to add that is storytelling. In the Somali culture and in some refugees, storytelling is part of the culture. And I think if you read the stories to them, they might feel comfortable to also tell their stories in their own way.
Great points. Thank you, guys. And if we do come across a child that very clearly needs mental health intervention and some counseling, what would be the first steps that a school teacher, for example, could take?
Is that for me or?
Sure.
Okay. I think for me, my experience has been really making sure that, especially make sure that the family is on board, because just because we identify a problem and we want to help, we want to make sure that we have families are on board with us. And once the family is on board and really kind of defining, having a common goal, then you can take the next step of referring to a child for treatment.
And at the same time, the family could support, your work, and if they know what's happening to their child, or if there's certain things they're doing that's reinforcing, they could provide the child other experiences within the community that could help with healing and growth.
Yeah, and really align with the families, not only what the child wants, but what the family wants. So do the family see the same problems that you are noticing? And then what are the approaches that they might have? And kind of for example, if you think the child is failing and that's affecting their kind of overall well-being, then maybe most of the PC families value education and want their kids to do well at school. So that's a common goal that you both can have.
I'd also like to add, you could also take it to the systemic level as well, and perhaps talk to your school counselor or your school administration, or depending on how many contacts you have in your own community, to really advocate for culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive service providers. If it's within the school or outside of the school. As Osa Bengoli has mentioned, whatever aligns with the family's goals and wants for the child, really bringing in the community and having that as a resource, whether it's services specifically for that to address any mental health concerns, or if it's something, a little bit more alternative or holistically based.
Great, thank you. We have a question here as well. How do we handle it when a child is having issues in the school and might bring that up with his parents, but the parents may not speak English very well and cannot relate that to the school personnel? And so the child ends up, by and large, needing to fight for himself. I'll just jump in and start with that, and I'll say that BRYCS is in the process right now of finalizing our third parenting handbook on raising teens in the U.S., and that is a handbook that is going to be released in a dual generation format. So that will, part of the book will be directed at teens, and the other part will be directed at their parents. And it's meant for the teens and their parents to sit down and have conversations on tough topics. And one of the sections is on parent involvement in schools and what the schools expect from the parents, how they can support their child, and how what a child can request realistically from their parents in coming into the school to support them. And we hope that we will release that by the end of this month. Do any of our speakers have any comments on that as well, on how we can better prepare parents for involving themselves in their child's education and mental health?
I'll jump in, and I guess I'm answering it slightly differently. But I would also, I would look at it and consider, what kind of resources and supports that the school is able to offer, or that they're able to advocate for more of. I know I've seen in schools that, parents have a really hard time engaging in the school because of this kind of example. There's no interpretation services, or it's limited interpretation services, and it's difficult to be able to navigate that system. But if there is a process in play, if that parent has come to the school and knows the process and knows who to talk to, and the supports that they have, at least that piece can be, can be addressed, and that support can be there for when the parent does show up.
And I'll just add by saying that I think any opportunity that the school can take to invite the parents, either school nights or school events. So don't call the parents only when there's crisis, or the family, but invite them when there's happy times, so good things are happening. So they can connect with the school in a positive way.
Okay, we will take 2 more questions here and then wrap up. We have a question here on students experiencing racism or discrimination in schools. We have some students in our school that are talking much more about experiencing racism. Are there any recommendations for dealing with this? Some say coaches, for example, are treating them differently. So this could be a whole topic in and of itself. But can anybody speak to that concern?
I can speak to it a bit. Like you said, Jackie, this could definitely be a full series, a full dissertation. It's certainly a complex topic. I think bringing it out in the open can be helpful, starting to discuss it open and honestly within the school. And I don't mean just talking to the one child who is identifying being discriminated against, but I mean your school admin, your community centers, your neighborhoods, and your classrooms. It really needs to come from every angle and every level, and to be able to name it, to see the harmful effects, but also to look at the strengths in diversity. And again, we can talk a long time about that, but that would be my suggestion on that.
Thank you. Yeah, BRYCS has a variety of resources on bullying and discrimination in schools. We did do a webinar last year on that, and we do have a training. I will put those links in the chat. I did just throw a link in the chat box on a highlighted resource list we have on this topic, and within that link there are reminders on how to file a discrimination complaint with the Department of Justice or the Department of Education should it need to be taken to that level. But as Julia just mentioned, I think it is helpful to start with the school and provide some cultural orientation to the staff on the populations that might be within the school to gain a greater understanding of the students that are in their classroom. And we have one final question here on how, let me find it one more time here. What would we do if a youth is expressing the desire to go back to their home country?
This is Goalie. Youth can say a variety of things to you, regardless of whether they're showing a traumatic experience. Really recommend before responding, when you hear something that's maybe even upsetting to you, first just take a moment to empathize and say back to them what you're getting, what you're understanding, to make sure you have the right understanding, the right feelings of what they're talking about. So with this child, so you're really having a hard time, you really want to go home, this place doesn't feel like home. And let them respond to your empathy, and with that you can respond even with more empathy. Reflect back again what they're saying. You don't have to repeat back word for word what they're saying, that's not empathy. But just kind of say back your understanding, highlighting their feelings that you're getting and hearing. And that in itself, just showing someone that you really understand them. Empathy is pretty powerful in creating a connection with you and the other person. And that in itself can just kind of help the child open up and talk about what's really maybe bothering them, or be willing to take your advice because they know that you really got them, because they've heard back what you said. You know, you've gotten their feelings, you've gotten their concerns and desires.
Okay. Thank you so much, ladies. You will see on the screen now our various modes of contact for BRYCS, the National Partnership on Community Training, and Refugee Center Online. Each of us do have our own listservs and social media accounts. So if you would like to follow what each of our organizations continues to do on this topic, please do find us online. And with that, I will close today's webinar with a reminder that a second webinar will take place on November 29th, offering best practices, tools, and tips on managing the trauma that we have talked about today. Many of you have already signed up for that webinar, so there is no need to sign up again if you've already done so. But if you haven't, I will shoot around the link now to register for that. And I will include it in the follow-up email that you'll receive on Monday. So with that, I will tell everybody to have a good day, and thank you so much for joining us on today's call.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
For your questions.
Thank you.